Para dun sa mga kaklase ninyo, nahabol pa? Of course, pwede pang umabol. Besides, recorded naman to. No? Next, no? Loss of the thing due. Of course, loss can be partial, it can be total. The thing, no, which is the object of an obligation, can be lost, can be considered lost if, no, it perishes. Or number 2, if it goes out of the commerce of man. Or number 3, if it disappears in such a way that its existence is unknown or it cannot be recovered. I believe I have explained this before, so let us not dwell upon this further. As a general rule, no, what happens when the object of a specific obligation is lost? So a determinate object is the one that was lost. Of course, the obligation will be extinguished. Okay? Provided that the thing was lost without the fault of the debtor, or before the thing or before the debtor has incurred in delay. Kasi as we have discussed many sessions ago, if the debtor has already incurred in legal delay and then after that the thing is lost, then the debtor can still be held liable for damages. Okay? Now, of course, if the thing was lost with the fault of the debtor, of course, damages can also be demanded. At kung maalala pa ninyo, di ba? If the obligor is liable, if the debtor or obligor is liable even for a fortuitous event, whether by law or by stipulation, or if the nature of the obligation requires the assumption of risk, then kahit na mawala yung thing because of a fortuitous event or what have you, the debtor can still be held liable for the object that was lost. Of course, another exception would be if the debtor has promised to deliver the same thing to 2 or more persons who do not have the same interest over it, and if the debt of a certain indeterminate thing proceeds from a criminal offense. So the obligation arises from delict, in which case, kahit na mawala siya, you would still have the obligation to what? Diba? Reimburse. Diba? Tatlo, diba? Either you return the thing stolen or you reimburse its value if the thing itself can no longer be returned, and then you indemnify the victim or the complainant for any damage caused. So even if the object is lost, if the obligation arises from delict, meron pa ring obligasyon to pay si accused or si convicted felon. Okay? Now, but what if the object of a generic obligation is lost? Genus non quam perit, no? Do not forget this one. Baka lumabas na to sa finals. If it is a generic thing that is lost, then the obligation stands. Because genus never perishes. You just replace the thing lost with something else that is similar to it, of the same quality and kind. Now, by way of exception, in case of generic obligations whose object is a particular class or group with specific or determinate qualities, particularly what we call limited generic obligations, then the loss of that limited generic object will in fact extinguish the obligation. But this exception is too few and far between. Just remember the general rule and you're good. If it is a generic thing that is lost, the obligation will not be extinguished. And what is the reason for that? Genus non quam perit. Genus never perishes. Now, what about what we call the doctrine of unforeseen events or relative impossibility? Hindi naman siya talaga imposible, but it has the same effect, no, as total impossibility. When the service has become difficult as to be manifestly beyond the contemplation of the parties, the obligor may also be released therefrom in whole or in part. For example, no? For example, meron kang kakontrata for the delivery of an electric keyboard, of a keyboard, no? Yung piano, kumbaga. Yan. A keyboard, a synthesizer, however you want to call it. Itong pagde-deliveran mo ay nakatira medyo sa malayo, no? It's an hour and a half na drive from where you live. And sabihin natin you live in an island, basically a group of islands connected by a series of bridges. Itong isla kung saan kayo nakatira, no, ay bagyuhin. Isang bagyo na medyo malakas, it destroyed the bridge that connects your place and the place of your creditor. Now, no, that bridge is the only way for you to be able to go to your obligees or creditor's place para ma-deliver yung keyboard. Kahit na ipa-LBC mo siya, doon din dadaan si LBC. Walang eroplano kasi nga bagyo o kasagsagan ng bagyo. At saka mahal, no? Mahal yung magpa-deliver ka through air. Wala namang mga choppers na lumilipad dun sa lugar ninyo. Now, certainly, sira yung tulay. Pero pwede mo namang languyin, di ba? It is not, strictly speaking, it is not impossible for you to go from point A to point B. Pero pwede mo namang tawirin. Lalanguyin mo nga lang. But consider that you are to deliver a keyboard. And while it is not technically impossible to cross that divide, but considering the nature of the obligation, making it so difficult to comply with the obligation, bordering on, you know, beyond the contemplation of the parties, beyond your imagination, na hindi mo naman, wala naman sa hinagap mo na ganun kalakas yung bagyo, wala naman sa hinagap mo na masisira yung tulay. Wala rin sa hinagap mo na while technically pwede mo naman languyin, no, yung tubig. Eh of course, hindi mo naman din ma-ensure na hindi mababasa yung keyboard. And considering the weight of it, hindi mo rin masasabi na baka mamaya ikalunod mo pa. So again, is it impossible to cross? No, you can't say that because you can technically cross. But considering the relative impossibility of the obligation triggered by the destruction of the bridge due to the typhoon, the obligor, basically you, may be released from the obligation, whether totally or partially. Now, what are the requisites for the application of this doctrine of unforeseen events? Of course, firstly, the event or change in circumstances could not have been foreseen at the time of the execution of the contract. Alam niyo bagyuhin. True, no? Bagyuhin yung lugar ninyo. So of course, it can be reasonably assumed that you have taken that into account when you entered into the contract or the agreement. But ang hindi nyo na-foresee is masisira yung tulay na ganun siya kalakas. Next, the event or change makes the performance of the contract extremely difficult but not impossible. Again, you can cross, no? Kahit na wala yung tulay, pwede mong languyin. Technically, it is still possible to cross. But it would be extremely difficult. Next, the event, of course, must not be due to the act of any of the parties. Hindi nyo naman kasalanan. Diba? A typhoon is an act of God. It is a kind of a fortuitous event, in fact. And finally, the contract is for a future prestation. Now, no? I know that we have already discussed compensation, but I just want you to take note of the following. There are different kinds of compensation. Compensation or set off, no? Ito yung quits na tayo. There is legal compensation which takes effect by operation of law. There is also voluntary compensation which takes effect by the agreement voluntary kaya nga of the parties. There is also judicial compensation, which takes effect by judicial or court decree. Basically, this is just a form of legal or voluntary compensation. The only difference is that it is the court which dictates. And finally, facultative compensation, where it can be claimed by one of the parties who, however, has the right to object to it. Dito tayo magfo-focus actually later on. Facultative compensation. Compensation. For compensation to occur, there must be compliance with the following requisites. There must be two parties, of course, no? Who are principal creditors and principal debtors of each other. Si X ay may utang kay Y. Si Y ay may utang din kay X. Okay? Both debts must, of course, consist in money. Or if the things due are not money but fungible things, no, consumable things, or things that are susceptible of substitution, the said things must be of the same kind and quality. So for example, bigas, no, kailangan same kind of rice. Both debts must of course also be due, must be demandable, and if it is an obligation to pay money, then the obligation must be liquidated. Next requisite, there must be no retention or controversy commenced by third persons over either of the debts and communicated in due time to the debtor. So walang salimpusa. Kasi pwedeng merong ibang person na meron ding claim doon sa isa, meron ding pwedeng singilin doon sa isa sa mga parties for compensation. Tapos sinabi niya, nag-intervene siya, no? Nakisingil siya. Kailangan walang ganun in order for compensation to happen. And finally, of course, compensation must not be prohibited by law. So take note, ito. The debts or the obligations must be, no, either in money or of consumable things of the same kind and quantity. For example, we have A and B. A owes B the amount of 6,000 pesos. Meanwhile, B owes A an AXI character worth 6,000 pesos. Matagal ko nang hindi nasusubaybayan ang development sa AXI. So I actually do not know how much these characters are at the moment. At saka diba, like any other crypto/NFT thing, I would think na volatile din ang market for AXI. Sabagay, it was that case at the very beginning, so I suppose it is the same case now. But anyway, baka mamaya may nag-AXI dito. In which case, good on you, good on you. So, si A ay may utang kay B. Pera, 6,000. Si B ay may pagkakautang din kay A. AXI character, worth the same amount. Can there be compensation? No. Because the debts do not consist of consumable things of the same kind and quality. So pwede lang magkaroon ng compensation kung pareho yung nature nung pagkakautang nung dalawa. So kung pera ang pagkakautang ni A kay B, dapat ang pagkakautang ni B kay A ay pera din. Now, how about this one? We have A and B pa rin. Now, A and B are blinks, no? Hardcore blinks. Now, YG Select, I would think YG Select is an action figure manufacturer, like Funko, like Good Smile for the anime themed action figures, mga tinatawag na Figma, if you're familiar. So now, A owes B any one of the 4 YG Select Special Edition Blackpink figures. Hindi ako sure kung released na to at the time I made this presentation. Probably, no? Probably nasa market na to. But I think this is limited edition. So sabihin natin, no? A owes B any one of the 4 figures. Now B, on the other hand, owes A any one din dito sa 4 na to. Can there be compensation? Yes, because while the things due are clearly not consumable, they are of the same kind. Kasi pareho lang. Any single one of these four figures. Pareho. How about the part where it states na kailangan there is no retention or controversy instituted by a third person? Ito ang example nun. We have A, we have B. A owes B 10,000 pesos. B owes A 10,000 pesos. Kung titigil tayo dyan, this is already a picture-perfect example of compensation. Parehong in money yung pagkakautang, tapos pareho din yung amount. Okay? However, there is also C. And B also owes C 10,000 pesos. So si A, may pagkakautang siya kay B na 10K. Si B ay may pagkakautang din kay A na 10K. Pero may utang din si B kay C in the same amount. Now, what did C do? C filed a case of garnishment of B's credit. Ano ang ibig sabihin nito? No? Yung pagkakautang ni A kay B, humarang si C. Basically, ang complaint niya sa korte, addressed to A, ang sabi ni C, mas may better right ako kesa kay B dun sa utang ni A. So basically, sinasabi ni C, wag ka kay B magbayad. Sa akin ka magbayad kasi may utang siya sa akin. At yung sinisingil ko sa'yo ngayon, ito na yung pambayad utang. No? Because C claims that she and not B is the creditor of A and that he should pay her. So yan ang claim ni C. Can compensation still take place between A and B considering that there is now a controversy initiated or instituted by C? No more. No more. Kasi may salimpusa na. Kailangan walang salimpusa. No retention or controversy when we talk about valid compensation. If there is one, then compensation simply cannot take place. Now, we go to facultative compensation. According to esteemed civilist, one-time senator, and one-time vice president, Arturo Tolentino, in his book series on the Civil Code, ang sabi niya, facultative compensation can be set up only at the option of a creditor. The creditor can renounce his right to oppose the compensation and he himself can set it up. It differs from conventional compensation because it is unilateral. So from here, though medyo roundabout yung paraan niya ng pagde-define ng facultative compensation, we can see that it is different in the sense that while generally, no, compensation should be by mutual agreement, di ba? Quits na tayo. Okay, di ba? May pagkakautang yung dalawang party sa isa't isa and then the parties mutually agree to cancel out their respective obligations. When it comes to facultative compensation, it boils down to the decision or the choice of just one party. Just one party, the creditor only. Walang say si debtor. Okay? So basically, that is what makes a facultative compensation. For example, no? A owes B 10 sacks of dinorado rice. Dinorado rice, if you do not know, is one of the better, no? One of the better kinds of rice. Of course, jasmine, Japanese rice, better. But dinorado is not bad at all. No? Masarap ang dinorado na bigas pag sinaing. Now, on the other hand, B owes A any 10 sacks of rice without any qualification as to which kind. Now, there can be no legal compensation here. Kasi walang identity between the kinds and qualities of the sacks of rice due. Ang pagkakautang ni A kay B, 10 sako ng dinorado. ang pagkakautang naman ni B kay A kahit na anong 10 sako ng bigas. But B can claim facultative compensation because he can deliver any kind of rice. No? B can claim that the obligation is extinguished if A delivers 10 sacks of dinorado rice. And then after that, he sends the sacks back to A. So for example, di ba? Ito ang sinasabi ni B. Pag nag-deliver si A kay B ng 10 sako ng dinorado rice, all that B needs to do in order to extinguish his obligation is to return the 10 sacks of rice to A. Okay? Kasi ano ulit ang obligation ni B kay A? Any 10 sacks of rice. So, nag-deliver si A ng 10 sako ng dinorado, sasabihin lang ni B na, kunin mo na to ulit, iuwi mo na. No? And that's B's obligation already. So, B may claim compensation. So, sasabihin ni B, wala namang point. Let's compensate. So, decision lang yun ni B. Now, of course, A may try to set up compensation, but B can oppose that. However, we have to take note that there are debts that may not be or that simply cannot be the subject of compensation. Particularly debts arising from contracts of depositum or deposit, no? Under Article 1962 of the New Civil Code. By the contract of deposit, we refer to a contract where one, the depositary, receives a thing belonging to another, the depositor, with the obligation of safely keeping and returning it. Kasi hindi mo naman talaga mako-compensate yan, going by the very nature of the obligation in a contract to deposit. As well as debts arising from the contract of comodatum, under Article 1933 of the New Civil Code. By comodatum, wala siyang English name eh. This is a exclusively named in Latin, but in Tagalog, we call this hiram or pahiram. Comodatum is when one delivers a non-consumable thing to another so that the latter may use the same for a certain time and then return it after. Again, the very nature of the obligation precludes compensation, as well as claims for support due by gratuitous title. Kasi ang support, obligasyon yan ng magulang o ng asawa para sa kanilang mga dependents. Hindi yan pwedeng i-compensate. No? Hindi porke, for example, nang hiram yung anak mo sa'yo ng pera, ibig sabihin nun, hindi mo na siya dapat sustentuhan para sa kanyang pag-aaral o kaya sa kanyang living expenses. Di ba nakapangutang ka na sa akin nung 1 buwan? So, ibig sabihin nun, dapat pwede na nating i-set off o i-cancel yung mga obligasyon ko na sustentuhan ka for this month. Pwede ba yun? Of course not. Because the law explicitly prohibits that. Of course, obligations arising from criminal offenses. For example, merong nagnakaw ng iPhone 13. Hindi na na-recover. So, ngayon, kailangan niyang i-reimburse, no? Yung amount. Magkano ba ang iPhone 13? Sabihin natin 100,000. For example lang. Hindi ko alam yung exact amount eh. Kasi beyond my pay grade. Wala akong pambayad sa ganun. So, sabihin na lang natin for purposes of discussion, 100,000 pesos. Sasabihin ni convicted felon, pwede bang i-set off to dun sa mga obligations ko to pay taxes? Diba? Kasi may obligasyon naman ako magbayad ng taxes sa gobyerno. Pwede bang i-set off na lang natin yun dun sa pinapagbayad nyo sa akin na amount ng iPhone? Hindi pwede yun. Because obligations arising ex delicto or arising from delict cannot be compensated. As well as certain obligations in favor of the government, like what I said just now, the obligation to pay taxes. Hindi rin yan pwede i-compensate. Now, how do we distinguish compensation and confusion? In compensation, there are two persons who are mutual creditors and debtors of each other. In confusion, there is only one person where the qualities or the personalities of the debtor and the creditor are merged. In compensation, there has to be at least two obligations. Otherwise, ano yung isa-set off mo? Diba? Kailangan at least dalawa. In confusion, there is only one obligation. Now, let us distinguish between compensation and payment. Of course, the requisites prescribed by law for these two modes of extinguishing obligations are different. Compensation takes effect by operation of law. Meanwhile, payment takes effect by the action of the parties. In compensation, the capacity to give and to acquire is not really necessary. Kinakailangan lang na nag-exist yung dalawang obligations na pareho, no? Meanwhile, when it comes to payment, the capacity to give and to acquire is essential. Bakit? Because, no, if the creditor refuses to acquire, papasok ang tender of payment and consignation. Of course, no, the debtor must be capable of giving the payment. Otherwise, meron din yung magiging epekto on the obligation. When it comes to compensation, as a rule, it is partial. Kasi, no, compensation can sometimes be total, but it can also be partial. Depende up to the extent, no, of the obligation that is due. Kapag ang pagkakautang ni X kay Y ay 5,000 at ang pagkakautang ni Y kay X ay 3,000 lang, edi yung obligation ni X kay Y na 5,000, hindi yun totally extinguished. Only extinguished up to the extent of the other guy's obligation. As for payment, of course, it has to be complete and indivisible. Just to reiterate, no, para hindi nyo makalimutan, as a general rule, the creditor cannot be compelled to accept partial performance. Payment and performance has to be complete, has to be total.